Welcome everyone to this debate today. So first of all, welcome to you, Nicu. Thank you so much for coming. We're honored that you're here today. And then also a big thank you to everyone joining from probably so many different countries here on Zoom. So this debate is organized by the European Debate Initiative. And we are a platform where we organize debates with politicians and journalists and activists, and where we try to learn from these people's experiences and try to use this as kind of what we can learn for the future as the next generation that will be the ones that rule the world, you could say. So for all of you that don't already do, please go and like us on Facebook so you can be updated on new events. But now let's start with today's debate, which is about the importance of the EU's neighbors to the East in terms of, for instance, security cooperation and the challenges with this. So we'll start with a brief introduction by Fanny of you, Nicu.
Yes, so welcome, Nicu. It's Nicu Popescu. It's a great honor that you're here with us. So I'll quickly introduce you. Nicu Popescu is an analyst and who currently is the director of the Wider Europe program at the European Council of Foreign Relations. They're based in Paris and write policy analysis of the situation also in Eastern Europe and EU-Russian relations. And Nicu has also been active in politics. So he has advised the former prime minister in Moldova. And in 2019, he was foreign minister himself. So you have these both two perspectives of the NGO world, but also the political world. And so it's an honor that you're here with us. Yeah, today we want to discuss three topics primarily. First, the challenges we have in the region and the response the EU should have. Then Moldova and the EU, so what the relationship could be and the situation today. And then finally, we'll conclude with some questions about your experience. So let me start. I mean, if we look at Europe today, we have the EU on the one hand, we have Russia, and then we have a whole range of countries in between. And this region between EU and Russia, we had a war in 2008 in Georgia. We had the war in Ukraine in 2014. We currently have peaceful protests that are being crushed in Belarus following election fraud. And we recently had a war in the Caucasus, so between Azerbaijan and Armenia. And so this idea or this promise of European peace for integration and cooperation doesn't seem to apply to this region in general. And my question to you is, if you're a foreign minister of a small country in this region, like Moldova, and you also know neighboring countries, as you do as an analyst, what worries you most when you look forward? And what should the EU adopt as a policy towards this region?
So thank you, Fanny, thank you, Zoe. Depends how many minutes I have for the response to your question. But
I mean, take what you need.
No, thank you very much for the invitation. To me, it's somewhat unexpected to see so many friends. I framed this in my mind as a e-meeting with students at the University of Amsterdam, but now I see it suddenly became a much bigger event, which I think poses to me the challenge of explaining some very basic things for people who have not followed Moldova and the Eastern Partnership countries. And then I have to marry that with, probably more than a dozen names on the list whom I recognize and who know the Eastern Partnership countries as well and maybe better than I do. So I will still try to keep it relatively basic. And if at some point you find that you've heard me saying these things on other panels, my dear friends, don't be too upset, because this meeting is for those who have not spent half of their career working on the region where I'm coming from. So I'll start by a couple of very basic things. As you know, there's no way for Europe not to be interdependent with its own neighbors. Problems that emerge and appear outside the EU very quickly end up being intra-European problems. And you have many examples. You have the refugee crisis, which besides the fact that affected Europe, led to the introduction of Schengen border controls among Schengen countries, has disrupted in massive ways politics in many European countries. In the case of the Netherlands, the tragic shooting down of the MH17, which happened because two of Europe's neighbors were at war with each other, and one of his neighbors, Russia, invaded and sent troops and sophisticated anti-aircraft weapons into Ukraine. So on a lot of these dimensions, and of course such examples can go on and on. Before, 15 years ago, 14 years ago, we had Ukraine and Russia being engaged in a gas crisis and European citizens in Slovakia and Bulgaria not receiving gas in winter. So many problems that happen outside the EU very quickly come to reverberate inside the EU. And they can take some very brutal forms of interdependence. You can have freezing EU citizens, you can have disrupted politics, and you have EU citizens who are killed because of problems that, and that, if you start from that, of course, the European Union has been trying to manage this interdependence. And to do so, it has launched almost 20 years ago in 2002, 2003, the so-called European Neighbourhood policy. And the logic of that policy was that it's in Europe's interest to try and make Europe's neighbors, the European Union's neighbors, be governed better, live in peace and try to have their conflicts solved, and try and stabilize security. Now, I repeat, that's a European interest. Of course, that's not charity on behalf of the European Union. This is something the Europeans have an interest to do. So the European Union has committed funds, political attention, investment of political will into developing the neighborhood policy. So 15 years plus later, if we look at the balance sheet of what the Europeans have been doing, and the reason it's 15 years, it's because of the enlargement to the east in 2004, when suddenly what used to be, countries like Moldova and Ukraine and Georgia, they used to be removed to free countries beyond the EU border, and they, after the enlargements to the east, ended up in the immediate vicinity of the EU. So the balance sheet 15 years later is very, very positive on several dimensions. Some of the most important ones is trade. That in recent years, the EU has created free trade areas with Moldova, Ukraine, Georgia, and that has dramatically allowed these countries to realign and basically become part of the European economy. And some of the statistics are actually quite striking. If you go and look at Moldova's external trade statistics, you'd see that around 65% of Moldovan trade goes to the European Union, and some 9 or 8% is with Russia. In people's mind, and even you framed it in your introduction, caught in between Russia and the EU. But if you look at trade, where Moldova or Ukraine are not caught in between. They are as dependent on the rest of the European Union market as many, many member states. And even some member states are less dependent on the EU market than Moldova is. On these kind of statistics, Moldova is like the Balkans. And Ukraine, the data for Ukraine is also quite interesting. For Ukraine, the EU takes more or less 50% of Ukrainian trade, and Russia is only 12% of Ukrainian external trade now. 12%. That's not a very big number. Of course, these trade dependencies have big political implications. If you're a country that trades this much with the European Union, but suddenly and dramatically decreases Russian leverage on your country, for example, when it comes to trade embargoes. But suddenly makes specific choices very easy. So many of you have followed the Euromaidan revolution in 2013-14, when Ukraine was choosing very painfully between signing the association agreement with the EU or not signing under Russian pressure. At the time, a third of Ukrainian trade was with the EU and a third was with Russia. In this sense, that was a difficult choice to make. But if you trade 60% of the EU, you don't have such dilemmas. The answers are obvious. Now, what didn't work very well in the East and in the neighborhood policy East are two things, I would say. One is anti-corruption. The EU has managed to help Moldova, Ukraine, Georgia stabilize economically, improve their democratic performance. But these countries, especially Moldova, Ukraine, Georgia is somewhat different, have not managed to really shatter and undermine and weaken the degree of corruption that binds the world of affairs and the political world. And that is, in the best case, it's unfinished business. And the EU leverage, and the EU has continuously pushed in that direction and tried to help, but the success of that is limited primarily, and it's not Europe's blame that Ukrainian or Moldovan politicians have been corrupt and stealing, but nonetheless, that's something which is worth realizing 15 years after the launch of ENP. And the second problem, where the EU was much more optimistic 15 years ago than it is now, is everything that is related to conflict and security. We are just, a few days after the end of the war in Nagorno-Karabakh that reminded us that there are unsolved conflicts. They can generate wars. And on that front, of course, we have a situation which is very bad for Europe in general, both in the East and in the South. In the South, as you know, we have Libya, we have Syria. In the East, in recent years, we have the war around and in Donbass. Now we have this war in Nagorno-Karabakh. And besides the fact that the European neighborhood policy has not managed to tackle these things, there's also a negative dynamic where the voice of the European Union has actually been less and less heard in these difficult conflict and warlike situations than it would have been 15 years ago. That was a moderately long answer to a short question.
Yeah, so I mean, it means in general there has been improvements in terms of trade and positive developments, but then concerning security and cooperation with the EU, for instance, they failed. And I think Nagorno-Karabakh, the conflict shows it quite well, that the EU didn't play any role, whereas Russia now comes forward as the main peacekeeper, sending troops and peacekeepers there now. I'll give Zoe the word to continue with the next question then.
Yes, I'd like to ask you some questions about something that you wrote in your policy brief, which is about EU security cooperation, exactly with the Eastern neighbors. And in this, I want to pick out a quote where you said that Europe, with its fondness for soft power, looks increasingly out of touch with global events. So instead, you argue that the EU should launch some security compacts to strengthen Europe's network of strategic partnerships in this region. And you think that this should include forming new alliances in Eastern Europe. But how would these new security alliances look? And why is it the EU's role to do this and not, for example, NATO? Because the EU is not a military power as such. What do you think?
There are several layers to this conversation. First of all, Europe, the EU, because technically Europe also includes the UK and Ukraine and Moldova and Georgia and Russia and Turkey to a degree. So whenever you hear me say Europe, I actually, in this very narrow context, I refer to the European Union, and it's just a shorter way and is easier to pronounce. NATO is a defense organization. It doesn't do foreign policy management. NATO does not have security partnerships outside NATO. There has been cases where NATO used its military force outside NATO borders. But NATO doesn't have security partnerships with substantial ones with countries which are not joining NATO or are outside NATO. And if you look at the world, if you want to be relevant, it's good to have friends. It's good to have friends on trade issues, on energy issues, on democracy promotion issues, but also on security issues. That's how politics is done. So, if you want, I'd give you some examples of models of power projection. The United States has NATO, but has many other bilateral partnerships with Pakistan, with Taiwan, with South Korea, many, many countries. France. If you go to France, France has a lot of bilateral security partnerships with states in Africa, in the wider Middle East. There are very strong links between defense ministries, cybersecurity agencies. If you go to Turkey, Turkey does the same. It has good security partnerships and political partnerships with a country like Azerbaijan. Go to Russia. Russia doesn't only constrain itself to having close relationship in the security sphere with post-Soviet countries. Recently, Russia opened a military liaison office in Serbia, which is an EU candidate country. Russia plays a security role in Libya, in the Central African Republic, in Venezuela. There were reports of Russia having some kind of unofficial security presence when events were not very stable. That's how you pursue international politics. And that's how also EU member states do so. There's nothing wrong, there's nothing illogical about it, but the EU itself has not been doing that. Partly it lacks the legal mandate to do so. And that I understand. But at the same time, legal mandates are not a given. Everyone is saying now that Europe should be more geopolitical, it should speak the language of power, and Europe's voice should be heard in security developments. And the way to do that, with several colleagues, I designed and proposed what I call the Eastern Partnership Security Compact. I'll maybe send you the link if you haven't had a chance to read it. But it's a way for the EU to start developing partnerships with the security and defense apparatuses with some states outside the EU, which have a good political and economic relationship with the EU. That's Ukraine, that's Georgia, that's Moldova, that's Morocco, that's Tunisia. There are several African states that could be part of such an initiative. What absolutely would be the wrong thing to happen is for Europe to remain constrained in dealing with the world only on economic and socio-political issues. Unfortunately, too much around Europe is done, too much politics is done by militaries. And when countries are decided to go to war or use military power to change developments in the neighborhood, you need to have some levers to influence those things. Now, it doesn't mean Europe should be sending troops wherever there is a new security imbroglio, not at all. But Europe needs to have the levers, the partnerships, the friends, the phone lines, and the influence to be sending signals, not just through diplomatic channels, not just through trade negotiators or environmental policy promoters, but also to the security apparatuses and institutions around the EU.
Yeah, so I think that the EU, as you say, cannot be like this only economic power. We need to step further than that. And maybe this idea is not as foreign as we think, because as you say, if there are so many bilateral agreements already in place between even member states and the Eastern European countries, but also the US and so on, then it's only maybe a natural next step, you could argue, that the EU becomes a security player as well.
If you want, let me start from another way, from another side. We've heard that the current European Commission, led by President Ursula von der Leyen, wants Europe to be a geopolitical actor. We have heard that the High Representative for Foreign Policy, Josep Borrell, says that Europe should speak the language of power. We have heard President Macron making the case strongly that Europe should have more influence in security developments. We've heard this. The next stage, and that we're not doing that yet very systematically, is to adapt Europe's existing policies and tools and mandates to these political objectives. Just very specific example, there is the European ENISA, European Network European Network and Information Security Agency of the EU. It's an agency which is supposed to help Europe build up its cybersecurity. But this agency doesn't have a mandate to talk to non-EU member states. So, for example, the logical thing to do, and there are things Europe wants to discuss on cybersecurity, be it with Russia, be it with Turkey, be it with Ukraine or Georgia or the United States. So sometimes you also need to adapt the legal mandate of EU institutions to be able to deal with other countries as well. But you also need to adapt the European Neighbourhood Policy East to the desire to turn the EU, to make the EU more geopolitical, European Neighbourhood Policy South, EU policy on Africa, and then develop it and turn a political objective into concrete policies.
So this, yeah, you say that as it is a political objective, yes, and it should be turned into true action. And something that relates to something you also said in this policy report. I think it's the one you referred to before. It could be another one, but you say that the Eastern neighbors are under constant assault from propaganda, foreign and illicit funding for political parties, cyber attacks on infrastructure, and so on. And isn't this is a lot of challenges? And how can security partnerships between the EU and the Eastern countries, how can in practice, how can we stop this? Because you said the US is already intervening, or at least playing a part. But what hole then can the EU fill, you could say, in these new partnership alliances?
We have some 30 specific recommendations. Some of them are somewhat tedious and small. At some point, we even say the EU should fund 50 scholarships for mid-career officials from the security sectors of Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova for, studies in EU member states. We're talking about opening the military Erasmus program to neighboring countries. And it's not just about Ukraine and Moldova. The same can be done with Serbia, with Albania, with the southern Mediterranean. But we're speaking at this level of details, right? There's help to be done on, for example, scanning cybersecurity vulnerabilities, on critical infrastructure, railways, electricity networks. On all of those things, Europe and its neighbors have an interest to help each other. And if I go to this, the single most expensive cyber attack that happened in the world, in global history, was an attack initiated against Ukraine called NotPetya, which ended up costing $10 billion and affected French companies, British companies, Danish, Swedish companies across the world. It's something which was designed to attack Ukraine, but it affected the EU. On issues like that, Europe has an interest to work together with countries like Ukraine to minimize cyber vulnerabilities. So, I posted you the link, you can go, but there are some of these recommendations are very specific and it will take time to implement, but there's no way to avoid those problems.
So these are a lot of and very ambitious plans. But in terms of time frame, when do you think that real change could happen? I mean, from the moment of signing some kind of partnership, in what form? In the form we'll see how that happens. But for example, in Moldova, the EU is, or they say they're supporting the rule of law and separation of power and fair elections and so on. And if we have to build on this and create new security partnerships, that's all great. But what is the time frame, or what would the realistic time frame be for this? And when can we maybe expect that there will be real substantial change in the Eastern European countries in terms of these principles?
This, I cannot give you an answer. There are many EU initiatives. Some of them move relatively fast. Some of them take years to get implemented. But of course, if you've looked at details, I think what I propose is probably going to take 10 or 15 years to implement. One very strong political will to start that. That's for the whole package. But a lot, the way Europe works very often is not so much through coming with big and bold political initiatives, but through salami tactics. You start doing small steps. Every 6 months you do one small step in the direction of something, and 5 or 10 years down the road, you have a substantial policy package which amounts to a big change of the EU approach. So on this, I cannot speculate about the future. Nothing is ever quick. For the Europeans, it's not quick, but no country manages to start projecting suddenly power very quickly, right? Now there's lots of talk about Russia doing this and Turkey doing that, but Russia's capacity to conduct war far away from Russian borders is the result of investments Russia made, of investments in the military that happened 10 years before Russia had this capacity. So before you start doing something, you need to invest, you need to commit resources, strategize, you invest for 10 years, and then you can do something with this. The same happens with Europe. If Europe starts developing stronger security partnerships with neighboring countries, with some of them, not all of them, it will take 10 years for Europe's voice to be more relevant than it is now. If Europe will continuously be reluctant to get into security policies internally and externally for all kinds of reasons, then there will be every time a new war in the European neighborhood, and we'll face the same situation of irrelevance, which is not satisfactory for anyone in Europe.
I mean, maybe we can take the example of Moldova, because it's a small country, but as you said, in the vicinity of the external EU border. So it has 4 million inhabitants, but it was the first country in the Eastern Neighbourhood which received visa-free travel to Europe. And a lot of Moldovan citizens have a Romanian passport or work in Europe. So there is a close link. And on the other hand, we also have Moldovan citizens working in Russia. And Vladimir Putin, the president, recently said that in the conference of Eastern Asia, that Moldova is experiencing external pressure because of the recent elections, and that this is unacceptable. So in a way, you already see that Russia is more active or more open about what it thinks about the region. And then my question is, what do Moldovans see when you speak of the EU? How do they look at Europe, and how would you explain European leaders that it's important that they care about Moldova?
Well, enough European leaders care about Moldova, which I'm not very worried. Moldova is Europe. It's not yet in the EU, but it's very reassuring. You go on the EU website and you find that all the European legislation and information is already in Romanian, and in Moldova, our language is Romanian. So on this, we do have a major advantage compared to basically most other EU neighbors, that Moldova, under the association agreement, is supposed to implement the European communautaire, the legislation and regulations. But our advantage is that we don't even have to translate that, unlike Ukraine or Georgia or many candidate countries. So in many ways, the cultural link is there. Also, on a very basic level, I think the mental maps of people don't always coincide with the geographical maps, right? Again, coming to, you invoked what President Putin had to say about Moldova, but if you actually take hard geographical numbers, you'd see that Chisinau is closer to Vienna than to Moscow. It's roughly the same distance to Venice as it is to Moscow, right? Even in distances, that's a completely different place. But distances matter. It's just transport is cheaper. Human links are cheaper. Everything is easier if you're geographically close. That's kind of on a more symbolic level. On a more practical level, you see, we all read more or less, the BBC, the New York Times, Financial Times, Le Monde, Le Figaro, Süddeutsche Zeitung, and what we've all been reading in the last 5-6 years or even more is that, you know, Russia is more present, is more active, is investing in this, is sending troops there. And that's true. But of course, from the experience of a country like mine, of course, we kind of notice that. But at the same time, I don't think Russia has more influence or more presence in Moldova than it did 20 years ago or 10 years ago. So yes, maybe if you're in the Central African Republic, there is more Russian presence, or Libya. But if you're in Moldova, in the last decade especially, Moldova has managed to have a much more diversified media market than it had 10 years ago, with more local channels alternative to Russian TV stations. Moldova just recently, a few months ago, has its first gas pipeline to the European Union, built with European Union funding and Romanian funding. So for the first time in decades, Moldova has alternatives to Russian gas if it wants to. On trade, they gave you the statistics. So on many fields, Moldova has been able to quite systematically delink itself. Of course, we live in a region where, you know, the presence of our neighbors is felt, be it Ukraine, be it Romania. You know, Russia has other capacities to project its power, not just through trade. We all know that, but I see Moldova as having been able to build capacities to resist over time. The situation is not perfect. It will take more decades to be a fully functioning, you know, to have a more comfortable geopolitically comfortable situation, but Moldova has been generally on a good track. Just to, you know, if you want to talk, you know, one other thing President Putin recently said about Moldova is that he started talking about who will buy Moldovan wines, and only Russia wants to buy Moldovan wines. And I'm sorry to say this in blunt terms, but he's been operating with statistics which are 15 years old. If you go to kind of the statistics of Moldovan wine exports, last year, Moldova exported almost 200 million lei to Romania, 156 to China, and 110 million to Russia, and 100 million worth of wine to the Czech Republic. So, you know, the Czech Republic buys almost as much Moldovan wine as Russia does. Romania does buy twice more. China buys more than Russia. So even on all of these things, Moldova has been doing, it's difficult, it's slow, but has been on a good path to make it itself, making itself more resilient.
I mean, that's a positive message then. I mean, maybe Russia is more strategic in how they talk and creating a narrative, but in the end, I mean, Moldova has good, I mean, close relationships with the EU, at least in trade and other cooperation partnerships. I think, yeah, no,
yeah, there are powers that oversell themselves, and there are powers that undersell themselves. So,
and maybe Russia is one of the first, and the EU is one of the second. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I mean, I think we have so many questions from the audience. Maybe we'll open the debate, because I think then we can't probably go through all of them, but some of them are quite interesting. So I'll give the floor to Zoe so you can try to moderate.
Yes, I'll try with one first question, which is about the rule of law erosion in the EU. So the question is, how can the EU promote its good governance agenda abroad when it suffers from rule of law decline within the EU? I think this is a very interesting and tricky question. I don't know if you have some comments about that.
I truly think this issue in the EU is worrying, but is grossly exaggerated. Yes, you have a couple of member states, but, you know, any comparison on the state of corruption and corruption is something which persists and is hard to eliminate. These are completely incomparable levels, right? Does it affect EU credibility? Well, yes, if you especially want to use excuses not to do anti-corruption reforms. You know, that's the whataboutism, right? If you don't want to, if you're a corrupt guy who pockets millions from doing politics in a country like Ukraine or Moldova or Armenia or Azerbaijan, you'll always find excuses to say, who are you to tell us? And now you'll invoke some member states not being the perfect examples before you'd invoke that, transition is a long-term process, we need more time, but we are on the right track. I mean, if you want to steal, you'll always find some excuse to continue stealing. So that's why, to be frank, I'm not very fazed by this idea, the EU now suddenly has a credibility problem. There will always be cases where things are not perfect. And, even before hearing of some member states in recent years, there was always issues with structural funding being misspent here and there. But the levels of it are uncomparable in the good sense with what happens outside in much of the European neighborhood.
I mean, it's true that, of course, if you do a comparison, the levels are maybe not as extreme, but in a way, I mean, it's not only about setting a good example. It also can become or be seen a bit as hypocritical to promote an agenda that you cannot uphold yourself. And I would disagree, at least, that the problem is not. Well, I think it's a very critical problem, and especially because it has developed the way it has in recent years, because the situation today is not the same as it was 10 years ago. If you look at, at least a few countries in Eastern Europe, or in the eastern part of the EU, Hungary, Poland, for example. So because it's an increasing problem, I think it's at least very difficult to ignore it when we promote the same agenda abroad.
But I'm happy to continue this conversation, but let's not confuse rule of law issues with corruption issues. And I've seen, major conversations about corruption levels in countries which have fewer rule of law issues than Hungary and Poland, right? Inside the EU. Sometimes they overlap, but they are not the same.
All right, I think there's so many questions, so we're just gonna pick a few out. And one more is the following: how can the EU get more involved in specific conflict resolution in, for example, Moldova or Ukraine? And does it want to, or can it? And is there a difference between wanting and being able to, in a way?
So there's a big difference between, I think the EU is super involved in the background of both conflict settlement around Donbass and Transnistria. It's not, I mean, in Moldova, it is involved directly. Around Donbass, it's involved through the member states in the Minsk process. But what the EU does in the background is hugely important. That's the sanctions on Russia for the intervention in Donbass. And the free trade area with Moldova has major effects on the economy of the Transnistrian region. So the EU is super present around the conflict settlement issues, but it hasn't been enough to solve the conflict. So I'd say the EU is super present, but not enough to solve the conflict. Now, if you ask me, I'd tell you that Russia is also super present in Transnistria, but not enough to solve the conflict on its own terms. And some of you know that Russia failed to promote this Cossack memorandum plan in 2003, but Russia also didn't have the power to solve Transnistria the way it wanted. And the EU also did not have enough power to solve it the way it wanted. So on this, there's always the EU can do something more. Now on Donbass, I think the European Union sanctions on Russia played a major role in making sure and in contributing to the fact that the war zone in eastern Ukraine did not expand too much. I think without EU sanctions on Russia, the war zone in eastern Ukraine would have been bigger, the degree of Russian involvement would have been bigger, and that would have meant more death, more destruction, more instability for the rest of Ukraine. So I do strongly believe that EU sanctions on Russia have managed to limit, not to backtrack, not to cancel, but to limit the escalation in and around Donbass.
Thank you. And another question is about the Transatlantic Alliance, whether the EU can actually pursue this cooperation and stability on its own, or whether it needs the US, and whether you think that now with the change of office, this will improve or be better for Eastern European countries.
Listen, I think one way to look at it is there are no absolutes in international politics. I mean, there's no such a situation if we are going back to corruption, right? There's no such situation as corruption, total corruption, and non-corruption. And the same goes to this transatlantic alliance. There's no situation of can Europe do something on its own versus can it only do it with the US? No country can do everything on its own. The US on its own also, we've seen, many US failures in many dossiers from Iraq to Afghanistan and even look at Turkish-American relations recently. No country ever, or no state ever manages to achieve everything on its own. So in this sense, no, Europe is not able, but that's why you have partnerships and alliances. And that's why Europe has, and the US have not just NATO, they also have good relations with South Korea, with Australia, with all kinds of countries. So in this sense, the main question about the Transatlantic Alliance is how much are the Europeans ready to contribute to what amounts to joint action to stabilize and improve the European continent or the wider Middle East. And whether, the US, the Americans do 80% and the Europeans 20% or 10%, that's one situation. If it's more of a 50-50 split, burden sharing, that's another situation. So I think the main battle is not to make Europe replace the US. That shouldn't even be feasible, and it doesn't even work for the US on a lot of dossiers. The main issue is how do we work together? Now, if you do only 10% of what the US does, it gives you much less influence on the US. And we've seen it recently with the Serbia-Kosovo dialogue, where the Trump administration came with some policies which were to the EU's dislike, or with Israel recently, right? But if you only contribute 10% to the overall security effort, no one's going to listen to you. If you're contributing 50% as Europe, you have a completely way of balancing and negotiating a joint approach with the United States. So the issue is not either or. The issue is the Europeans should take this much more seriously, should put the resources, and that will give them also a much better leeway in working together with America.
It's an issue of priority as well. I mean, whether, if we want to speak up, then we also have to contribute financially, of course. Do you have a next question?
Yeah, there's one more question here about the election in Moldova. What do you think will change in terms of Moldova's, you could say, picture internationally, and also in terms of the EU? So the relationship there could, in terms of the internal political situation, how could that influence its its picture abroad and in the EU?
Well, let us see the outcome of the elections. I think what is obvious, there's an obvious desire in Moldova for change, but there's also parts of the population that are less persuaded. Now, I think part of the problem in Moldova is there are significant cash and media, cash meaning money, financial, illegal financial infusions into Moldovan politics, media efforts, infusions into Moldovan politics, which is seriously misaligning and imbalancing the capacity of Moldovan political players to play a fair electoral and political game. So whenever you look at opinion polls, in a political environment which was less prone to external interventions, pretty massive ones, we'd be speaking of much better electoral mathematics in Moldova than the numbers we're looking at now. At the same time, Maia Sandu has a very good momentum, very good dynamism. You had major credible allegations of corruption and misrule towards current President Dodon. So I think all the chances are there for the Moldovans to opt for a better candidate who will be in a much better position to win friendships and partnerships for Moldova. Because as things stand now, Moldova, under the current leadership, it's very hard for Moldova to mobilize and benefit and promote its interest in partnership. In all, not just with the European Union and primarily with the European Union, but also with countries like Ukraine. Of course, Romania is a neighbor and is part of the EU, but basically now, for this very moment, Moldova's political partnerships with Romania, with Ukraine, with the EU are quite frozen. And you'd probably not expect, but relations with Russia are not great either. And today's Moldova's outgoing president is, for example, is quite pro-Russian in statements and intent, but for some reason under his leadership, Moldova pays more for Russian gas than Germany does. And Russia still keeps most of its embargoes on Moldovan goods. So in this sense, of course, for a country that is small and desperately needs a good and functional foreign policy and desperately needs capacity to access markets, to build political partnerships, having a foreign policy in a coma is a major disaster.
Yes, sorry. Yeah, I mean, this is, we'll have to wait probably for the outcome of the elections, but it would, if Moldovan citizens also want change, and I think if Maya Sandu has a chance of winning, this would probably also change the policy they have towards Russia or the EU. And maybe from a more personal point of view, I mean, you've been an analyst, so you worked in NGOs, but you also worked in politics, so as a foreign minister or political advisor. What would you say, how did this experience of working in politics change your view on problems or conflicts in the region? Did that influence you, or what did you learn from from that experience?
Well, I learned a lot of things, but we don't have a lot of time for that. The format of an offline meeting would have probably been better, but there's several things. I think one of the most you referred to. Yeah, I spent my whole professional career in foreign policy, and making the leap from analyzing in foreign policy and speaking at events like that, but before COVID, they would mostly be in person. It's not a major difference if you speak in front of 100 or 200 or 300 people at a conference or in a press conference as a minister. You're quite ready for that. You can formulate your thoughts, you can articulate them. So on this, if you're asking me about this transition, that was the easy part. At the same time, in our specific case, and that was a peculiar case in Moldovan politics, foreign policy ended up being more or less 25% of my job. The other 75% were three issues. One was management of coalition politics. And we had a complex political coalition with pro-Russian political parties and two political parties within a pro-European bloc. So there were issues and discussions, and both on the foreign policy course of the country, but of course, you're involved in many other issues which are not related to foreign policy, but to general reform process. The other thing that takes some time to get used to is, of course, handling media storms. And there's always a media storm, but it takes a bit of time for your skin to be a bit thickened in the face of that. Of course, in our part of the world, and it's not just Moldova, it's also Ukraine, it's also many EU member states, you have a lot of very fair and competent media, but you have also mercenaries working in media organizations who are just there to target and pursue specific agendas without, irrespective of what different actors do or don't. So that was another part of the job. And the third part was, of course, managing the foreign ministry. And that's a challenge in itself. It takes some time to get to grips with, but it also takes time. So in this sense, if you're asking me about this transition, in some way the transition was not very complicated. Other things took a bit of time to getting used to.
Sorry, I was muted. Yes, I am looking through. There are so many questions, so we probably won't have all of them.
Long, so I actually cannot read long questions.
No, so we'll try to make them short. But there's one question about that it seems like the interest of the EU in the Eastern European region has been decreasing. And this person is writing that the current High Representative kind of ignores this region. And how would you explain this? Or do you agree? Do you disagree?
Depends how long you spent in this business. So I spent in this business almost more or less 20 years. And of course, compared to 2003, 4, 5, the level of EU presence and interest has massively increased. If you go back to 2004-ish, more or less, the EU had just 2 diplomatic representations in the Eastern Partnership countries, in Tbilisi and in Kiev. And Kiev was covering Belarus and Moldova, and Tbilisi was covering the 3 South Caucasus states. If you look at the number of everything that is administrative capacity, desk officers, trips, contacts, all of that has massively changed. There's much more interest. Now, it's also true that in 2010, 12, Moldova was considered a success story of Eastern Partnership. There was a major desire and hope that Moldova would be able to reform. You know, in the early years of the Poroshenko presidency, there was a similar hope on Ukraine. In the first year of Zelensky's presidency, there was a similar hope in Ukraine. So EU attention partly also is much higher now than 10, 15 years ago. But it also goes up and down, you know, and it oscillates every couple of years, depending on whether the governments in these countries are seen as the reformist. So the moment you have a government that is willing to start doing reforms and starts doing them, suddenly the level of interest goes up and people want to invest and go the extra mile to help Moldova, Ukraine, Georgia to do the right thing. There's enormous amounts of goodwill. But the moment when you have to interact with, you know, people like Yanukovych or Plahotniuk or Dodon, suddenly European interest and appetite to interacting with these people suddenly goes very low. And that's natural. But this level of interest, nonetheless, doesn't mean that the EU is disinterested. There's lots of things happening. You know, I gave you trade statistics. There are real life events happening. So I mentioned you the gas pipeline connecting Moldova to the EU market. That started probably around 2011 or 12. You write a letter, you do a feasibility study, you look for the money, you commit the money, you do a tender, you buy the pipes, you import the pipes, you buy the compressor stations. All of it takes what, 7-8 years in the case of Moldova. And that has not stopped. So yes, at specific points, the attention to a place like Moldova goes up and down. But on some key measurements of efforts to help Moldova, the EU has had a very steady investment and presence, and Romania in this case. And these real life projects, they don't oscillate as easily as the attention of politicians.
Yeah, so you could say it's probably difficult to draw like a straight line of this is where the interest was, this is where it's gone. It goes up and down. But of course, some projects and some, especially with trade, as you say, those are, well, long-term investments that don't change overnight. So it's maybe both a steady and an unsteady relationship.
But generally, I hope there are lots of students on this call. But you know, the way I read the news is to know that 50% of what happens in the world is news. Is BBC, is BFT, is whatever, Handelsblatt. But 50% doesn't make it in the news. And that 50% is statistics. You look, trade statistics, demographic statistics, energy statistics. They don't get reported so much. Even when they get reported, they are hidden on page 29 of a newspaper. But they, over time, they often have much bigger impact than the news. I give you another example of, and sometimes they are contrary to what the news are saying, news cycle. So look at Russia-EU dialogue. A lot of people complain that after Ukraine, EU-Russia dialogue is frozen, is not happening. It's to a degree true on political levels, but if you go and look at the statistics of Russian gas export to the EU, in the last 3 years, Russia has been beating all historical records of these exports. Russia never sold as much gas to Europe per year as it did in the last 3 years. So yes, some kind of political dialogue was frozen, but some other kind of dialogue, which is an energy trade, has been going through huge levels of intensification, right? And this is a case where statistics actually contradict the news. So it's always good for you to double check the state of the world by looking at things that don't get reported.
Yeah, interesting. And also because statistics, yeah, also as you're indicating, they're not always neutral and then they're always present. And the same statistics can be presented in different ways, you know, according to the graphics and so on.
That's what you are taught on the ESPSS course. But even with that, if you compare this to how news can be misrepresented, even the most manipulable statistics are much closer to the truth than the amount of opinion and, you know, and uninformed journalism that we get. So, and that's not to kind of complain about journalism, but well, there's also a dynamic, you know, what sells? Scandal sells, war sells, emotion sells. The business model of the media, of the free media, makes it less likely they will report on boring stuff like statistics. But most of us here are political scientists or future political scientists, and that is why every time you hear that the president wants to realign his country east or west or to China or to Africa, before you ask yourself, you know, is there a realignment? Go and check the trade data. Or go and count how many visits they have done to Beijing versus Delhi. And they might, you know, there's presidents who say, we want to be equidistant between Beijing and Delhi. Go and count his visits in the last 3 years, for example. And they will tell you a different story, probably. You might discover that he's been 10 times to Delhi and only once to Beijing. So his words are a lie, or her words are a lie, right? So some of these statistics are not so difficult to trace.
Yes, I think we're running out of time, so I'll have a quick wrap up of what, well, in my opinion, what we think we've learned today. So we've talked a bit about the European neighborhood policy and how its aim is that its neighbors should be governed better, but that we maybe need more than just the diplomatic and economic cooperation. And we've talked about Moldova and how it's not necessarily, you know, caught between the EU and Russia. For example, in terms of trade, that it trades a lot with the EU. Now we talked about, you know, what doesn't work with the EU neighborhood policy, how it should be changed, about how this relates to NATO and the conflict in, for example, Donbass. And we've talked about the elections with Moldova and how this can maybe change how Moldova is perceived abroad and how Moldovans perceive maybe themselves. So we've gone through a lot. Yeah, and Fanny, you can go on.
Yes, I mean, thank you so much for taking your time and joining us. It's a very exciting time also for Moldova now with the elections coming up. And yeah, it's important to stay positive as well, to see what has worked, looking at not just the news, but statistics, as you said, and taking, yeah, forming your own opinion on the region and looking at positive stories. So, I mean, it's great that you joined us. I hope the audience has also learned some new things about the region. And yeah, thank you so much for joining. It was a great pleasure. Oh, you're muted, sorry.
Thank you very much as well for this invitation, and hope to stay in touch.
And one last thing, one last point we would like to make is if we can have the PowerPoint up as well, is well, of course, thank you for coming, both Nicu and everyone that joined. And before we end, we'd like again to urge you to go and find us on social media, especially on Facebook, because we'll be posting a lot about new events, which will be coming very soon. For example, we'll have events soon with different human rights organizations. And so you should definitely follow us there. But thank you all for coming. It was a really fruitful debate, and we hope to see you next time.